Welcome to the Materials Testing and Inspection Annual Radiation Safety Refresher Training. Today we'll cover topics such as regulations, ALERA, gauge storage, transportation, and use, emergency procedures, and radiation theory. States are regulated by either the NRC or their own state program. Those states that choose to have their own program are called agreement states, and those states are Washington and Oregon and all the other states in the western U.S. other than those listed as an NRC state. NRC regulated states are Idaho, Montana, South Dakota, Wyoming, Alaska, and Hawaii. As well as this list here, Wyoming has applied to become an agreement state, so at some point they will have their own program to follow. All agreement states have a program that meet all NRC regulations. Sometimes there are additional state regulations. For instance, in Washington, while transporting a gauge, the gauge case must be covered with a tarp or some sort of cover so that the box is not visible during transportation. If you are going to transport a gauge across a state boundary, be sure you speak with the local or corporate RSO beforehand. There may be some special cases or special instructions for transporting that gauge across a state boundary. ALERA is an acronym you hear a lot of times with radiation safety, and it means as low as reasonably achievable. The concept of ALERA has to do with the time, the distance, and the shielding between you and the radioactive source. The time you're there, the distance away from it, and any shielding you might have in between. Keeping in mind the concepts of ALERA, things you do not want to do are extend the rod unless the gauge is over the test hole. We don't want the rod outside the shielded area unless it's going directly into the ground. You do not want to expose yourself or others to unnecessary radiation. And you do not want to allow others near the gauge when taking a test. The radiation emitted from a gauge cannot be turned off, so we must practice the ALERA. The best we can do is to keep the rod inside the gauge at all times when it's not actually taking a test. Again, ALERA has to do with time, distance, and shielding. Those of you familiar with the Orville television show, it's a picture of Lieutenant Alara Catan, Chief Security Officer on the Orville. Time. The less time a person remains in the area of radiation, the lower the radiation dose that person will receive. Work should be carried out quickly and efficiently, but with attention to safety. Distance. The intensity of radiation and its effects fall off sharply as you move further away from the radioactive source. The dose rate decreases as the inverse square of the distance from the source. For example, by moving twice as far away from a radioactive source, you're exposed to only 1/4 the amount of radiation. Moving 3 times as far away means 1/9, and so on. For instance, let's compare background radiation from cosmic radiation levels. At sea level, you'll receive about 30 millirems per year from cosmic radiation, and at 10,000 feet altitude, you'll receive approximately 140 millirems per year. Shielding. Shielding is a protective material placed between you and the source that reduces the level of radiation to which you are exposed. The source, in its capsule, is inserted into the gauge source housing, which shields the radiation emitted from the source. So you've got this little tiny source pellet up here, and it's put inside this capsule, and then the capsule is placed inside this housing, and that housing is actually welded to the end of the tip of the rod for the source that comes out of the gauge, and it's inside the housing for the source that stays inside the gauge. Some sources of radiation, as we've already talked about, are solar radiation, nuclear medicine, X-rays, of course. There are cosmic rays, which contribute to radiation. Radon is another contributor to radiation. Actually, as humans, we give off a small amount of radiation. Other sources of radiation are nuclear power plants, different types of foods and drinks. There's terrestrial radiation, radioactive waste, and a variety of consumer products can all be considered radioactive sources. Let's talk about radiation dose limits. The general public is allowed 100 millirems per year over background. Once they are trained through the 8-hour course that Troxler gives, or APNGA, or Bruce Peterson, or something similar, then they are allowed 5,000 millirems per year. And you, as an adult radiation worker, are allowed 5,000 millirems per year. Minor radiation workers are allowed 500 millirems per year, as well as a fetus is also allowed 500 millirems per gestation period. So if a woman becomes pregnant, that fetus is allowed up to 500 millirems during that gestation period. For fun, astronauts are allowed 25,000 millirems per mission. I know once they get outside our atmosphere, the amount of cosmic radiation skyrockets, so that's why they're allowed 25,000 millirems per mission. Dosimetry badges. Up here in the top right hand corner, we've got a photograph of a dosimetry badge. It's even from Qualtech, which is where we're getting ours currently, and they get these from Mirion, which is just exactly what we do. So the dosimetry badge measures the radiation exposure or dose. There will be quarterly dose reports posted near the gauge storage area or another place designated by your local RSO. We keep ours right on the door to the gauge storage facility. The report shows the dose for the previous quarter as well as the annual to date and your lifetime exposure. If you're ever going to leave MTI, you should request a dosage report, lifetime dosage report, so that you can provide that to your next employer if you're going to be working around radiation. And if you're new to MTI, you should be bringing one of these with you if you have previously worked around radiation. MTI requires that your badge be worn at all times when transporting, working on, working around, or using a nuclear density gauge. Only wear the badge assigned to you by the local RSO, so don't be wearing somebody else's badge, because then if it comes back showing an overexposure, we won't know which person that overexposure belongs to. And if your badge is lost or damaged, you need to contact the local or corporate RSO immediately so that a replacement can be ordered. Replacements only take a few days to get. They are easily ordered online, and we can get them in as quick as about 2 to 3 days. Damaged badges can also sometimes be analyzed, so you do want to return that badge even if it is damaged so that it can be analyzed. A little radiation will brighten your day. Take care of your badge as it is company property. Good idea would be to clip it to your safety vest. A lot of the vests have a little loop up there in the shoulder area. That would be a great place to keep that. And while you're wearing it, you don't want to stop near any electromagnetic or radiation emitting sources. Of course, excluding nuclear density gauges, because that's what we're there to check. And you also don't want to wear them into a medical or a dental facility because they could be doing x-rays, and obviously that will affect the exposure. Lastly, you don't want to leave it on the dashboard of your vehicle. A lot of times that extreme heat can cause some really bizarre readings on those. We've seen them come back extremely high because of that. So don't leave those on the dashboard of your vehicle, or really anywhere where it's going to be getting really hot or in the sun for an extended period of time. More on dosimetry. We've got radioactive man over here on the right. In the case that a badge shows an overexposure, the local RSO is going to interview the gauge user, and together they will fill out a report indicating how that overexposure occurred. And if the overexposure is found to be only the badge and not necessarily the user, that overage can be deducted from your total exposure. Like we said, as a trained radiation worker, you're allowed 5,000 millirems per year. It is possible the overexposure can result in an annual or lifetime dose being exceeded. So in that case, the user may not work around radiation any longer. One quick story about the previous bullet item. George DuPont used to tell this story. It's sort of legend now, but a guy was going on an extended leave. He was going to be gone about a month. As he's putting his gauge away for the last time, his badge comes off of his shirt and falls into the case. And it's stored in the case for about a month until he comes back, goes back to work, and lo and behold, he finds his badge in the case, and it's been in there for a month, and it was highly overexposed, and they were able to figure out that that was the case. They wrote a letter to Mirion and had the majority of that exposure deducted from his annual and his lifetime dose. Gauge, transportation, and use. Got some more radioactive man over here on the right. Transportation and use and storage. MTI requirements are radiation safety training certificate from an approved source like APNGA, Troxler, or BHP. I think the one that we like the most is Troxler. I feel like they give the best training for the amount of time that's spent there. And BHP is Bruce Peterson. I don't know if he's giving classes anymore or not, but that is possible. MTI also requires that you go through this refresher training annually. So again, next year you'll get to watch this approximately 1 hour video again. You have to complete the hazmat test annually. The requirement here really from the NRC is that it's done every 3 years, but because that time frame is difficult to track, we just do it annually. It's a quick and fairly easy test. I'd actually call it more of a quiz, and so we do those annually. You'll fill out a training acknowledgement card that essentially says that you agree that you've been trained, you've taken a test, you've been through this refresher training, and you know all there is to know about radiation. You will also need to have a gauge operator wallet card, and we now issue these via email as a PDF, and so instead of printing that and keeping it in your wallet, those of you that use an iPad in the field can just keep it on your iPad in case someone asks to see it. Failure to properly store, transport, and use a gauge can lead to violation and fine to you personally as well as to MTI. Fines for NRC violations start at $3,000 as of 2017 data. Violation of the MTI radiation safety program can be punishable up to and including immediate termination. Storing a gauge at a licensed facility includes making sure the handle lock is in place and clasped. While these are not the types of locks you would be using, we do want to make sure that that handle lock is in place and clasped just as tightly as Ric Flair has the figure 4 leg lock clasped onto Hulk Hogan. The gauge must be inside the case unless it's charging or drying. The case needs to be behind at least one door with 2 locks, or the case needs to be behind 2 physical barriers, such as doors, and each of those locked independently. MTI also has continuous recording cameras at each licensed facility to monitor in case of theft. Storing a gauge at a temporary location must be approved by the corporate RSO. The handle lock must be in place and clasped. The gauge must be inside the case and the case locked. The case needs to be stored inside a locked or secured building or inside a non-portable container such as a land-sea container, also known as a connex, or a job box that's chained to the axle of the job trailer. The case needs to be locked to the permanent fixture inside the building or non-portable container. Signage requirements are the same as for a licensed facility, so a sign that indicates radiation area must be posted. There are several steps for transporting a gauge. Step 1. Choose the gauge you'll use and verify that the case has all the required transportation stickers and that they are all readable. One of the required stickers on the top or side of the case must be this rectangular UN3332 RQ sticker with red lettering on white or silver background as displayed here. Again, this must be on the top or on one of the sides of the case. The other sticker that's required on both sides of the case is the yellow and white diamond-shaped radioactive 2 sticker with readable source nuclides, activity, and TI. Again, we need to make sure this information is readable. The Transportation Index, or as I called it before, TI, is the maximum radiation level at 1 meter from the surface of the package, in this case, the storage case for the gauge, and that's recorded in millirems per hour. The source nuclides for these gauges are americium-241 beryllium and cesium-137. The activity is the quantity in gigabecquerels and millicuries. On the diamond-shaped sticker, it must be listed in both gigabecquerels and millicuries. Step 2 for transporting a gauge is to be sure the gauge is charged and is in good working order and all the tools are accounted for. Also verify that the handle lock is present and clasped. Step 3 when using a gauge is to make sure you use the gauge-specific utilization log. Note the date and the time within 5 minutes, the user's name, and the destination. If the gauge is going to be used on a single job that day, go ahead and name that job site. If it's going to be in a variety of locations, go ahead and give a general description like the towns that it'll be in or the town it'll be in or something along those lines. Step 4 is to load the gauge using the MTI approved techniques such as getting help from a coworker, sliding it on and off of a lift cart, and moving the case and gauge separately. On a loadout, you would leave the gauge in the storage room, you would put the case into the vehicle, and then go get the gauge and place it back in the case and lock it up. Step 5, we're going to use 2 chains or cables. So those of you that aren't aware, this rapper's name is 2 Chainz, and this comic book character's name is Cable. You need to use him or two of this guy, just kidding, to attach your gauge to the vehicle. You want to run each one up through the opposite side handles and through the top handle, finally locking each one to the case hasps. It's going to look something like this below, and you're going to use a ratchet strap or blocking to secure the gauge from sliding around in the back of the vehicle. So on these chains or cables, it's going to be permanently attached to the vehicle. It's going to run up through the side handle, over the top and through the top handle, and then come back over here to the hasp. On the other side, it's going to be permanently attached here. It's going to run up through the side handle, over to the top handle, and down to the hasp. At that point, you're going to use the ratchet strap to tighten this up against the tailgate so that that case can't be moving anywhere during transportation. And then this is a side view of the same thing. Step 7, take the gauge binder. And that's going to include the bill of lading, which is your transportation papers, and you want to place that within arm's reach of the driver and on top of any other items in the vehicle. It can also be placed in the door pocket on the driver's side. That seems to be a pretty good place to put it. If you've got a bunch of stuff in the passenger seat or the floorboard on the passenger side, you just want to make sure that gauge binder is on the top of that pile. Do not put the gauge binder on the dashboard because that can impair your vision and keep you from seeing what's coming at you. Step 8 is to drive defensively. You got to watch out for those other motorists out there. I also wanted to mention that non-trained personnel are not allowed in the vehicle during transportation. So if you're going to take other people besides yourself, and you also need to transport a gauge, those people need to also be radiation safety trained. If you're going to leave a gauge in your vehicle and be parked somewhere, like you're going to go in to the McDonald's for lunch or something, you want to try to park where you can have line of sight with your vehicle. Make sure that you're able to see the vehicle in case someone walks up to it and starts checking out your gauge and seeing what's in there and possibly trying to steal it. So if no line of sight is available, you want to park in as public a place as possible in hopes to deter someone from cutting those chains or cables and stealing the gauge. Next, we're going to go over the contents of the gauge binder. And actually, to start with, we're going to talk about that outside pocket with the clear cover on it. That outside pocket is going to have a laminated gauge-specific bill of lading and emergency procedures back to back in there. So we'll laminate those two items back to back and slide it into that outside clear pocket of the gauge binder. The next thing inside page 1 is the gauge-specific bill of lading one more time. So there's going to be 2 of those with the binder, and there's also going to be 2 of the emergency procedures. So page 1, gauge-specific bill of lading. Page 2 is the emergency procedures. Got some more radioactive man for you over here. And we're going to go over the remaining contents of the gauge binder. Not really in any specific order of how they go in, but we are going to need a copy of the NRC or the state-issued radioactive materials license. Those of you in Washington will need to carry a Washington license. Those of you in Oregon need to carry an Oregon license. And those of you in Idaho will need to carry the NRC license. If we're going to travel from state to state, we need to make sure that those binders also include a copy of the state license or the NRC license as applicable for each state you're going to be in. In the case of Oregon, they have a required specific to the gauge license that you would also need to have to transport that gauge into the state of Oregon. Also, we're going to need a copy of the calibration records. Those need to be current. A copy of the leak test record, also just the current. Any special form certificates, so these are going to be for each of the two sources in the gauge. So there will be two of them, and in most cases they're 2 to 3 pages long. You're going to want a copy of the standard count log, and these are gauge specific. They have the gauge number, information about the gauge, the serial number, the transportation index, the quantities, and all of that stuff listed on them as well. So you need to have a standard count log with that. Also, we include the gauge operation manual in case you need that while you're out on the job site. If you have questions on specifically how to perform a particular task with a gauge, like trench correction, or if you're having issues with standard count or something along those lines. Also, you're going to have any additional state license required forms or paperwork, like I said before, regarding the the ODOT. They require a specific gauge license to also be in that. Next, we're going to cover jurisdiction. The NRC, state, or the DOT have the authority to audit the storage facility and the program at any time. The DOT can conduct roadside audits of the vehicle, the gauge, and your paperwork. The DOT can also confiscate the gauge if necessary, and they could do this in the case that you don't have proper transportation papers. State police, fire marshal, sheriff, police, the INL, and Hanford site can all audit the program and facility by appointment. To check out a gauge, the first thing you'll want to do is select the gauge to use that day. You'll want to be sure the calibration and leak test are current. If you're going to be testing asphalt, you'll want to check and see if the gauge has been correlated to the asphalt mix design used on the project that day. If it is not correlated, but there is another gauge that is, you may want to check and take the gauge that is correlated instead. If you're going to be traveling with the gauge to a government facility, you'll want to make sure that the gauge is on an approved list. For instance, here in Boise, we transport gauges to the Mountain Home Air Force Base on a fairly regular basis. There are 3 gauges that are on the approved list, and that list has been approved by the Mountain Home Air Force Base Radiation Safety Officer. The next thing you'll do is complete the utilization log, and we spoke about this before, where you're going to include the date and the time within that 5-minute time period. Location of the use, and if it's multiple locations, go ahead and list those out or give some general information about those locations, like the town or the towns that you'll be using it in. Next, you'll want to load and transport as previously described. On a lifting reminder, your 3 options there are to get help, use a cart to slide the gauge on and off of, or you can remove the gauge from the case and take them to the vehicle separately. Gauge use safety. You'll want to make sure that when you're taking a test, you're keeping others at least 20 feet away from the gauge. If they won't stay back 20 feet, go ahead and pack up and pack the gauge and lock it in the vehicle and let them know that once they back off and let you do your work, that you'll get back to work. Never leave the gauge unattended. You want to stay within 10 feet if it is not locked and secured in the transport case. So if you're on a job site, don't turn your back to the gauge, don't walk away from it. You need to stay within that 10 feet, and sometimes closer depending on the situation. If there's a lot of heavy equipment running around, staying closer than the 10 feet radius is a better idea so that you can grab that gauge and get out of there with it if you need to. Do not turn your back on the gauge. It's not going to get you, something else might get it. So we don't want it to get run over, we don't want it to get stolen, and also we don't want another user to come and take it from you. We have a duty to keep others safe from exposure. Here's your fancy ionizing radiation pie chart. The radiation emitted by the gauges is ionizing radiation. So we've got yellow, black, and yellow like a bee. So there you go. As far as standardization, standardize the gauge using the manufacturer recommendations, and they recommend one daily standard count and also at each job site. So if you're only on one job site, one standard count. At multiple job sites, you'll do multiple standard counts. You'll want to make sure that when you standardize the gauge, you're on a dry and flat area. You want it at least 10 feet from any large vertical surfaces like a wall or a vehicle or a big water tank or something along those lines. You want to make sure you're at least 33 feet from other radioactive sources. 33 feet also is approximately 10 meters. You want to make sure that you're doing the standard count on asphalt, concrete, or compacted soil that is at least 4 inches thick. These standard blocks for these gauges are gauge specific, so be sure that you're using the standard block for the appropriate gauge. Redo the standard count if the faceplate is disconnected from the gauge, the battery pack is disconnected, or you have odd test results that keep coming up. You'll want to record the standard count results in the gauge-specific standard count log and verify that the results are within the required range based on the previous 4 standard count results. This is an ASTM requirement and it's also an AASHTO requirement, so these are things that we need to do. AMRL or the AASHTO resource will be looking for those types of records when they come, and also the NRC or your state programs may be looking for those records as well. When those standard count logs get filled up, you'll want to be sure you deliver those to the office RSO so they can scan those and upload them to the server. The next thing you need to do is validate your calculations for the standard counts, both the moisture and the density count for soil. So your density standard needs to be within 1% of the average of the previous 4 standard counts. So you take the average of the previous 4 and make sure that your new standard count is within 1% of that average. The moisture standard needs to be within 2% of the average of the previous 4 standard counts. The validation calculation for asphalt is this little beauty here. It's a little more difficult. I just copied this right out of the ASTM, and essentially you're taking the current standard count and subtracting the average of the past 4, and that needs to be less than or equal to 2 times the square root of the average of the past 4 divided by the value of any prescale. And that prescale value is something that's given by the manufacturer for each gauge. We do have a spreadsheet to do that validation of the standard counts for both soil and asphalt, and the prescale factors are in there. It does all of this automatically. All you need to do is put the previous 4 standard count information in and also the current standard count information, and it will tell you whether it passes and is validated or not. So when you're taking a test, the handle lock should be engaged when it's not in use. So as you're hiking from spot to spot, if you're going a ways, you may want to go ahead and put the handle lock on in between tests. You need to keep the gauge locked in the transportation case when it's not in use. So if you're going to have lunch or sit down and write a report or something along those lines, you'll want to make sure that you lock that gauge in the case and make sure that the case is appropriately locked into the vehicle. You'll want to follow the training for completing a test dependent on the material type and configuration. So the training that we will have received for actual gauge use, taking a test is what you should depend on in this situation. Do not extend the source rod except directly into the test hole. We talked about this earlier, and we want to make sure that the gauge is sitting flat on the ground when the source rod is extended. Don't do that. Don't do that. Don't do that. And don't do that. To check a gauge in, so now you've been out to the field with the gauge, you've transported it back appropriately locked into the vehicle. Again, here's your lifting reminder. You get some help from a coworker. Use a cart to slide the gauge on and off, or you can remove the gauge from the case, take it into the storage facility, and then go back out to the vehicle and retrieve the case. You'll complete the utilization log by this time writing down the time that the gauge was turned in, and you'll be sure that all the locks and doors are properly latched. So the lock on the handle of the gauge, the locks on the case, the locks on the doors to the storage facility, whether it be a cabinet or a room. You want to make sure everything is all locked up and properly latched. We've seen locked doors before that were not actually latched, and that is a problem. Emergency procedures. The first thing you'll want to do in case of emergency is to see the MTI gauge emergency response information. And it's on the back of that laminated card that's slipped into the front pocket of the binder. It should also be page 2 in the gauge binder. And that's going to cover any emergency procedures in case you need it. If there's any auto accident, if it's the gauge is run over, if the probe gets stuck in the ground, you need to make sure that you're keeping people 50 feet away. Only those trained can approach, such as hazmat workers. Sometimes fire and sometimes police are trained in hazmat, but not always. So it may be up to you to keep the people away and to cordon off that area and keep people out of there. You'll want to contact the RSO as soon as possible, and the RSO will respond with a survey meter. Any excessive readings may cause a call to the hazmat response, and if no excessive readings, then the gauge can be transported to the storage facility and quarantined, and you'll have to quarantine it until the RSO performs a leak test and those results are back and they're reviewed and they are within the limits of the leak requirements. At that point, we'll need to determine any course of action. If there's a leak, then it'll have to be possibly disposed of in the proper way. All of that will be done by your RSO, and the gauge will likely need to be sent in for calibration, possibly repair. If the RSO does not respond to your phone call, contact the Troxler emergency line. The phone number is on the emergency response information card. So we'll talk about radiation theory here for a few minutes. I wanted to go over non-ionizing radiation, which is radiation that doesn't have sufficient energy to dislodge orbital electrons. So it does not have the ability to change any makeup of the cells in your body. Some examples of that would be things like microwaves, ultraviolet lights, most lasers, radio waves, things like infrared light, and radar. Now, ionizing radiation, on the other hand, is what we're using when we're testing the soil and the moisture and the asphalt, and in some cases concrete, and that radiation has sufficient energy to dislodge those orbital electrons and actually change the cell structure. Some examples of the ionizing radiation are alpha particles, beta particles, neutrons, gamma rays, and X-rays. More on the radiation theory, we're going to talk specifically about gamma and neutron. Here's a portable gauge in backscatter transmission mode. You can see that the neutron source remains above the surface and radiation is emitted into the ground and scattered back to the detector to provide a measurement of the moisture content or density of a material. So in this case, the neutron source is here. It's emitting radiation into the ground, and it's going to come back to the detector, and that's going to give moisture and density information. Next, we see the gauge in direct transmission mode, where we've pushed the source down here into the soil. This goes on to say that portable gauge use is widespread in industries such as agriculture and construction. Go figure. So now we've got the gamma source underneath the surface of the ground inside of this tube, which we talked about how that was encapsulated earlier. Radiation is then transmitted directly to the detector on the bottom of the gauge, allowing accurate measurements of the compaction. And again, right here is where that gamma source is in this case. So neutron is going to detect moisture and gamma is going to detect density. Here's a little graphic just to kind of give you an idea. You can see that the radiation source is here. Your alpha particles can be stopped by something as simple as paper. The rest of these go right on through paper. Beta particles can be stopped by something like wood. The other two of these keep going. Gamma particles will be stopped by concrete, and that's what we're using is gamma and neutron. And neutron particles can be stopped by thick concrete. One more look at the various types of ionizing radiation and their different penetrating powers. This illustration portrays the ability of different forms of ionizing radiation to penetrate paper, the human body, wood, and lead. So again, you're going to see alpha stopped by paper, beta is going to stop here by your skin or your hand. Gamma is going to go ahead and travel right on through the majority of this stuff and be stopped by the lead. X-ray is going to go right on through here and through the wood, but it's not really going to go any further than that. And neutron really is just going to blast through all of this stuff, and if the lead or the concrete is thick enough, that will stop it. That concludes our training. I'd like to thank you all for listening in, and we'll get to do this again in about a year. I wanted to ask, are you guys excited? Because you probably are, but are you this excited? Anyway, thank you for sitting through the training today. I appreciate it. And if you have any questions, get with your local or corporate RSO. And thanks.